Those who knew someone who went missing, what happened? My stepsister went missing about a year after my stepdad married my mom. We had just moved into our new house a couple states away from where I grew up and I didn't know anybody. My stepsister was 3 years older and helped me make friends at school. We lived about a mile from school and walked there and back a couple days a week when my mom had to go to work early. One day I walked back home from school alone because my stepsister had basketball practice. There had been some robberies in the area, so my mom had us carry pepper spray with us, and I remember feeling weird that day. I got home fine, and a few hours later, we hadn't heard from my stepsister, so my stepdad called the basketball coach to see if practice went late. We didn't have phones. The coach said my stepsister had left the school a couple hours before. A few months later, after a lot of searching, her body was found in the woods near the school. There was pepper spray residue all over her skin. They never caught the person who did it, but she was murdered with the rock the police found near her body. My cousin, who I barely knew, disappeared along with his car, leaving behind a large blood stain in his apartment. Right from the start his roommates were suspects, but several years passed and his body was still missing. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries or America's Most Wanted or one of those, and a tip came in giving the location of his car in a nearby river. His body was found in the trunk, and the roommates confessed and went to prison. I went to the same elementary school as Michael Dennehy. He was kidnapped off the playground and still not found to this day. I remember after it happened every parent showed up to walk the entire school of kids home. I also remember running ahead of the pack for whatever reason and all the parents were screaming at me to get back. They were terrified. A family friend went to a Metallica concert. During intermission she went out to have a cigarette and the venue wouldn't let her back in. There's footage of her walking through the parking lot and then she wasn't seen again. They ended up finding her body a year or so later, and through DNA, connected it to another crime. Because of that DNA they found the guy who did it. It was awful. Morgan was her name and she was beautiful and talented and had her whole life ahead of her. A friend went missing one night in June 2016 after a night out. He had an argument with his girlfriend and wandered off on foot. Days went by, and there was no info. Find out, he'd somehow been hit by a car, and died. He didn't have his wallet on him, so it took a bit for them to identify his body. No one understood how his significant other wasn't with him, or what led up to him walking off in what I think was a drunken state. Not me, but a poor old guy at Costco. This old guy, maybe late 60s, came up to me and said, "Jimmy, I think that's the name," he said. "Is that you?" I said no. His face sank. I talked to him for a bit. Apparently his adult grandson Jimmy vanished a few years before and I looked just like him. He said the family had no idea where he is and hadn't seen him in years. He just up and moved away without telling anyone. The guy didn't seem like he had dementia or anything, just a grandfather looking for his grandson. This was a few years ago. I felt really bad for the guy. His heart probably got super excited only to be broken again when I wasn't Jimmy. I hope Jimmy eventually contacted his family because his grandfather seemed really sad about it. Guy I went to school with and kind of grew up around, his mom is one of my mom's best friends, went missing in 2010 on his way home. Police and search parties searched everywhere looking for him and his truck. He had to pass over a bridge to get to his house, so it should be noted that the lakes were searched by divers and dragging the lake as well. 4 years later, 2014, the water levels were very low and someone called in saying they saw a tire sticking out of the surface of the water near the bridge he would have had to cross to get home. It was him and his truck. At least the family got some closure after 4 long, excruciating years. My great-grandfather disappeared when his youngest child, my grandfather, was a toddler. Records were finally found, decades later, showing he had moved across the county, changed his name, remarried, and had additional kids. My brother's middle school teacher. He just didn't show up to school one day, which was very unusual. The school scrambled to find a substitute for him, because they had no notice. We had a whole school meeting like 2 days later when he was officially missing where they told us all about it. He left the house that morning as usual, according to his wife later said. He was never seen again. Many search parties were organized, and people looked for months, but they never found him. He is still officially missing today. My brother's middle school teacher. He just didn't show up to school one day, which was very unusual. The school scrambled to find a substitute for him, because they had no notice. We had a whole school meeting like 2 days later when he was officially missing where they told us all about it. He left the house that morning as usual, according to his wife later said. He was never seen again. Many search parties were organized, and people looked for months, but they never found him. He is still officially missing today. My town is small. In the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains for some context. Everyone knows everyone, so when someone goes missing you notice. First was a lady that was friends with my mom. Let's call her M. She owned and operated a sandwich shop. My mom was working for her and helping her out at the time. One day M just didn't come to work. Her husband showed up instead. Day 2, she didn't show up. M wasn't answering calls and her husband was telling everyone she left town suddenly. Ran away. My mom didn't believe him and reported her missing. 2 or 3 days later her body was found in a well at their camp residence. Her husband killed her and hid her body in the well because he was caught having an affair. He's in prison for the rest of his life. Second person is basically the same thing. Only she was never found. Her boyfriend is the #1 suspect but her body has never been found and he's still walking the streets. A close family friend was missing for about 5 days. He jumped off a bridge to try to kill himself but he was found below it. He broke a lot of bones and kept himself alive by using his shoe to lift water from the creek beside him to stay hydrated. My story much happier than many here, sad face. When my cousin and her husband, and kids, went on a vacation to Curacao, around 35°C that time of year, a few years ago. The area is covered in thick jungle, and it was made clear to everyone who went there that you needed, or was required, to stay on the paths. He decided to go for an evening stroll while the rest stayed at their cabin. Took a 1-liter bottle of water and his phone with him, nearly no reception as soon as you walked into the bush, some gum and went off path anyway, because he probably got curious. Search and rescue were busy doing their searches, along with volunteers, around a large area, and he was found 5 days after he went missing about 2 kilometers from where he went off path. He died from a heat-induced heart attack, but was probably already completely unconscious before that happened due to dehydration. He was 47. Goes to show you, when you are told not to go off path because people tend to get easily lost in thick jungle, do not go off path. It might actually kill you. He ended up on the other side of the country, started a new life, and died 30 years later. He had schizophrenia. The family didn't know where he was all those years. They went on a wilderness hiking trip alone in Hawaii. They never came home. No body was ever found. As it turns out, this has happened in Hawaii to quite a few people over the years. I guess it is a more dangerous region than people generally understand. Around July of 2022, an old high school classmate of mine went missing. She was a mother of 2 boys, one of them with special needs. The last known contact she had with anyone was when she told a friend of hers she was going to the store, but she never returned. The police were informed, and a missing persons report was filed. Her phone and wallet were found at her home. A boyfriend she was dating was questioned and released without any indication of foul play. She's never been seen or heard from since. About 8 years ago was at a bar with my university roommate around midnight. A guy I don't recognize comes up to my roommate, they exchange some words and give each other a big hug. Turns out they were old childhood friends. He sticks around and we shoot the shit for an hour or so, super nice dude. Said he had to go meet some people but if we're still out he might come back this way. We stay for a couple more hours, he never comes back and we head home. Around 2 weeks later my roommate finds out via Facebook he went missing that night and they found his body dumped in a storm drain a few days later. It's still kind of surreal typing this out now that we were maybe some of the last people he talked to. They did catch the people that did it though, so that was good at least. Edit. Whoa, this blew up. Unfortunately I didn't learn what happened specifically, whether it was a drug deal gone bad or he OD'd with some other people and they panicked and dumped him, but my roommate later told me that they caught the people that dumped the body in the storm drain. When I was a kid a friend of mine was kidnapped by his dad. The mom got custody and the dad just showed up one day and took him. It was devastating for everyone, especially the mom and brother, why he only took one kid. After about 5 years of police investigations and the mom having to change her legal name and go into hiding, they finally found him and got him back home. He was safe, but he was really quiet for a few years after he got back. I have no idea what happened during that time. What I do know is that he seems incredibly well adjusted now and last I heard he's happily married. This was my friend's brother. He disappeared and his apartment had blood everywhere, as if from a struggle or suicide attempt. Years later he showed up on his brother's doorstep and said he had been off living as a shaman somewhere. Who knows how accurate that is? A neighbor's son vanished while jogging in our neighborhood. He was an avid runner and it was unlike him to not come back on time. Days turned into a frantic search involving the entire community. Unfortunately, his body was found in a nearby river. An investigation revealed he had been struck by a hit-and-run driver and his body was dumped to hide the crime. The perpetrator was eventually caught, but it was a devastating loss for his family. My cousin was kidnapped on her way to school. It was over 20 years ago and she's not been found. A friend of mine's sister went missing in the early 80s. We always suspected she was a victim of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. We found out a couple of years ago that she is in fact on his list of suspected victims. My uncle drove my cousins all the way across the country to visit my grandma, but then just up and left, without his children, a couple days after arriving, and then disappeared for several years. Come to find out, he had moved to the Philippines and started a brand new family over there with his brand new Filipina wife. He still won't talk to any of us, including his own children, even though we've tried contacting him several times throughout the years after he showed back up on Facebook. Douchebag.